Early in the morning of the 27th of May, 2015, a squad of plainclothes police officers walked quietly into the lobby of the Baur, a five-star hotel on the shore of Lake Zurich, one of the most expensive addresses in Switzerland. They were not there for a robbery. They were there for breakfast guests. Over the next few minutes, they arrested 7 of the most powerful men in world football, one by one, and led them out to unmarked cars. As one of them was walked to a vehicle, hotel staff scrambled to hold up white bedsheets, trying to hide his face from the cameras. These men had flown in for the FIFA Congress, the annual gathering of the people who run the biggest sport on earth, who were 2 days later going to re-elect their president. Instead, they were about to be extradited to the United States, accused of turning the beautiful game into a criminal enterprise. This is the story of the money behind the World Cup, where it comes from, where it goes, and how the organization in charge of it became the target of one of the largest corruption cases in the history of sport. So let's follow the money. And to understand the crime, you first have to understand the scale, because the numbers involved here are almost difficult to say out loud. FIFA, the body that organizes the World Cup, is, on paper, a non-profit association registered in Switzerland, the same legal category as a local chess club or a stamp-collecting society. And yet, across the 4-year cycle that ended with the 2022 World Cup in Qatar, that little non-profit generated a record $7.5 billion. $7.5 billion. And it is not slowing down. FIFA's own projection for the current cycle, the one ending with the 2026 World Cup, is around $13 billion, the single biggest jump in its entire history. This is an organization that, in real terms, runs one major tournament every 4 years and turns it into more money than the annual revenue of some of the most famous companies on the planet. So the first question, the obvious one, is simple. Where on earth does all of that money actually come from? The answer is that almost none of it comes from the football itself, in the way you might imagine. Break down that $7.5 billion, and the biggest single slice, around $3.5 billion, is television. Broadcasting rights. The money networks all over the world pay for the privilege of showing you the World Cup, because they know that, for 1 month every 4 years, a huge chunk of the entire human race will stop what it is doing and watch. The next enormous slice, roughly $1.8 billion, is sponsorship and marketing. The giant brands whose logos ring the pitch, who pay a fortune to be officially associated with the tournament. Then, there is licensing, the video games, and the merchandise. And then, comparatively small, is the part you personally pay for, the tickets and the hospitality. In other words, you, the fan in the stadium, are almost a rounding error. The real product FIFA is selling is your attention, packaged up and sold to broadcasters and sponsors for billions. And the culture around all that money could be dizzying. At the 2014 World Cup, the members of FIFA's executive committee were reportedly handed luxury watches worth tens of thousands of dollars each. A casual gift, the kind of thing that barely registered at that altitude, until FIFA's own ethics rules forced many of them to hand the watches back. That was the world these decisions were being made in. Private jets, 5-star hotels like the Baur, and a level of comfort utterly detached from the packed, sweating stands the whole business ultimately depended on. When you spend long enough in a world where a $25,000 watch is a party favor, the line between a gift and a bribe can start to look awfully thin. Now, hold that thought. A tax-advantaged non-profit sitting on billions of dollars with reserves that hit almost $4 billion. Because here's where it gets interesting. An organization like that has to answer to somebody, right? And technically, it does. FIFA is made up of more than 200 national football associations, from the giants down to tiny island nations, and they all, in theory, have a voice. But the real power, for decades, sat with a small executive committee, a couple of dozen men, and that committee held the keys to the single most valuable decisions in all of sport, because the committee decided who got to host the World Cup, and the committee decided who got to sell the television and marketing rights to tournaments all over the world. And those decisions, those votes, were worth billions of dollars. Which brings us to the uncomfortable truth at the very center of this whole story. When you have a tiny group of people controlling decisions worth that much money, the decisions themselves become a product, and a product can be bought. And there was a second, quieter source of power woven through all of this, one that rarely made the front pages, but mattered just as much. Every one of those 200-plus national associations, from the mightiest to the smallest, receives money from FIFA. development grants, funding programs, cash to build the game at home. On its face, that is a wonderful thing. It is how football reaches places that could never afford it alone. But it also meant that people at the top of FIFA controlled a river of money flowing out to hundreds of voters. And in a system where the tiniest nation's vote for a president or a host counts, on paper, the same as a giant's, control over that river was control over the outcome. Loyalty, in other words, could be cultivated. And that dynamic sat quietly underneath everything else. That is exactly what United States prosecutors alleged had been happening quietly for a quarter of a century. On the same day as those dawn arrests in Zurich, the U.S. Department of Justice unsealed a staggering document, a 47-count indictment running to more than 160 pages, laying out what they described as rampant, systemic, and deeply rooted corruption. The core accusation was breathtakingly simple. Officials had allegedly been taking bribes and kickbacks, payments under the table, in exchange for their votes and their influence, particularly over who won the lucrative rights to broadcast and market football tournaments. The initial figure prosecutors put on it was around $150 million in bribes over more than 2 decades. As the case grew and more defendants were added, that number climbed to well over $200 million. Marketing companies, the prosecutors said, would pay officials to hand them the rights to tournaments, and everyone in the chain took their cut. This was not one bad apple. The indictment painted a picture of an entire culture, an accepted way of doing business, hiding in plain sight behind the shining trophies and the anthems. And it is worth understanding how a scheme like that actually functions, because it is less like a briefcase of cash in a dark car park, and more like a system. In many of the cases prosecutors laid out, the bribes flowed through the sports marketing companies. The firms that buy the rights to broadcast and sponsor tournaments then sell them on. To win those rights, prosecutors alleged, the companies would agree to pay officials millions of dollars, funneled through shell companies and offshore accounts, disguised as consulting fees or investments. Tournaments like the Copa America and the qualifiers watched by tens of millions across the Americas became, in effect, cash machines. Every set of rights another opportunity for someone to take a cut. And this was not a single round of arrests. Later that same year, in December, American prosecutors came back and indicted 16 more officials, widening the net across the confederations that run the game across entire continents. It was starting to look less like a scandal and more like the operating system of a sport. And no single figure came to embody it more than Jack Warner. For decades, Warner was one of the most powerful men in football outside Europe, a kingmaker from Trinidad who controlled a huge block of votes across the Caribbean and North America. When the indictments landed, Warner was among the most prominent names on the list, accused of soliciting and accepting bribes over many years, in schemes that prosecutors said ranged from World Cup ticket allocations to the diversion of funds. Warner denied wrongdoing, handed himself in to police in his home country, and then spent years fighting extradition to the United States. His fall, from untouchable power broker to a man battling in the courts of Port of Spain, became the human symbol of just how far and how deep all of this reached. And here's the part that should really make you sit back, because none of this was new. The 2015 raid felt like a thunderclap, but the storm had been building for decades. For most of its early life, FIFA was a modest organization with modest means. That changed from the 1970s onward under a Brazilian president named João Havelange, who, together with the men around him, turned the World Cup into a global commercial juggernaut, courting sponsors, selling television rights all over the world, building the financial empire we have been describing. But underneath that transformation ran a darker current. FIFA's longtime marketing partner, a company known as ISL, collapsed into bankruptcy at the start of the 2000s. And when investigators picked through the wreckage, they found ISL had, for years, been paying enormous secret commissions, kickbacks, in plain terms, to sports officials in order to lock up those lucrative rights, tens upon tens of millions of dollars. The trail eventually led to the very top, and years later, Havelange resigned his honorary position at FIFA as the findings became impossible to ignore. Long before the FBI ever walked into that hotel in Zurich, the same basic machinery, rights, votes, and money quietly changing hands to grease them, had already been running for a generation. The 2015 case did not expose a new disease. It exposed how deep and how old the existing one really was. And to bring a case like that, you need someone on the inside. You need a man who was in the rooms. And the man who was in the rooms was an American named Chuck Blazer. For years, Blazer was one of the most influential figures in North American football, a general secretary, a FIFA committee member, a fixer who seemed to be everywhere. He also lived a life of almost cartoonish excess. He reportedly kept apartments in Trump Tower in New York, including, according to widely reported accounts, a separate one used partly for his cats. He was enormous, larger than life, a man who moved through the sport's most exclusive circles for decades. And then the American authorities caught up with him over his taxes and his finances, and Chuck Blazer made a choice. He agreed to cooperate. He became an informant. He reportedly carried a recording device disguised as a keychain, and he walked back into those same exclusive rooms, sat down with his colleagues, and secretly recorded them. The man at the heart of the machine became the machine's undoing. And what of the men who blow the whistle? Their stories rarely end in triumph. Blazer himself was banned from football for life, his own corruption laid bare in full, and he died in 2017 while still cooperating with the authorities. A man who had lived like a king, ending as a cautionary tale. It is a recurring pattern in these scandals. The people who finally expose the rot are almost never clean themselves, and they almost never walk away unscathed. The truth, when it finally comes, tends to arrive through deeply compromised messengers. So, when the police walked into the Baur that morning, it was not a random raid. It was the surfacing of an investigation that had been running in the shadows for years, built partly on the recordings of a man who had decided to flip, and the timing could not have been more brutal. 2 days later, FIFA held its presidential election anyway, and its long-serving president, Sepp Blatter, was re-elected, insisting the organization could not be held responsible for the actions of individuals. It lasted 4 days. Under enormous pressure, with the scandal metastasizing by the hour, Blatter announced he would step down. The most powerful man in football for 17 years, gone in less than a week, and he would not be the last domino to fall, because the scandal did not stay confined to the men in handcuffs in Zurich. FIFA's own internal ethics investigators turned inward, onto the very top of the pyramid. At the center of it was a payment, $2 million, that had been made to Michel Platini, the president of European football, and, until that moment, the overwhelming favorite to become the next president of FIFA. FIFA's ethics committee ruled that the payment was improper, and it banned both Platini and Sepp Blatter, the two most powerful men in the entire sport, for 8 years from all football activity. Both men denied any wrongdoing and always insisted the payment was for legitimate work done years earlier. And it is important to be fair and precise here. Years later, in a separate criminal trial in Switzerland, a court actually acquitted both Blatter and Platini of fraud. But the football bans had already done their work. Two men who had run the global game for a generation had been swept off the board. The hosting votes, in particular, drew the sharpest scrutiny of all because they were the most valuable prizes FIFA could hand out. Take the 2010 World Cup, the first ever held in Africa, in South Africa, a genuinely historic, emotional tournament. American prosecutors would later allege that a payment of $10 million, routed through FIFA's own accounts, was in reality a bribe to secure the votes of certain officials for South Africa's bid. South African authorities and officials described that money instead as a legitimate grant to support football among the Caribbean diaspora. The truth of it has been argued over ever since. But the very fact that one of the sport's proudest moments could be dragged into a bribery indictment tells you how completely the suspicion had seeped into everything. And through all of it, one question kept getting louder and louder because it touched the most valuable prize FIFA has to give. How exactly does a tiny desert nation with almost no footballing history, summer temperatures that can hit 50 degrees, and a population smaller than many single cities win the right to host the World Cup? Qatar's successful bid for the 2022 tournament became the lightning rod for every suspicion anyone had ever had about how these decisions get made. A whistleblower who had worked on the bid came forward with allegations that money had been paid to secure votes, including a claim that a sum was paid to football officials in Africa. FIFA commissioned its own huge internal investigation into the bidding for both the 2018 and 2022 World Cups, led by an American lawyer named Michel Garcia. And then, when FIFA published only a summary of his findings, Garcia did something remarkable. He publicly disowned it, saying it contained incomplete and misleading representations of his work, and he resigned in protest. Qatar has always firmly denied any wrongdoing in winning the bid. But the sequence, the allegations, the enormous report, the summary, and the investigator walking away in disgust left a permanent cloud hanging over the decision, one that no official statement has ever fully cleared. And there was a human cost sitting beneath the glamour that no financial statement ever captured. The building of Qatar's tournament, the stadiums, the vast infrastructure, relied on an enormous migrant workforce, and the treatment and welfare of those workers became the subject of years of intense international scrutiny and criticism. Whatever the final accounting, it was a reminder that decisions made in five-star hotel rooms in Europeland, eventually, on real people, far away, who never got a vote. So, step back and look at the shape of the whole thing. You have an organization that is technically a nonprofit, but generates more money than most corporations. You have a small number of people controlling decisions worth billions. You have a quarter century of alleged bribery, a mountain of it eventually admitted and proven in court, with officials pleading guilty and being convicted. You have the two most powerful men in the sport banned. You have the crown jewel tournament awarded to a host that triggered a suspicion so deep the lead investigator quit rather than put his name to the official version. If this were the plot of a film, you would say it was too much. And yet, here is the part that should genuinely make you sit up. Because after all of it, the arrests, the guilty pleas, the resignations, the bans, the global humiliation, FIFA did not get smaller. It did not get poorer. It got richer. Revenues went up. The tournament got bigger. The 2026 World Cup is the largest in history. 48 teams, 3 host nations, that projected $13 billion. New leadership arrived, promised sweeping reform, and pointed to a cleaned-up house. And the machine, battered and exposed, simply kept rolling forward, more lucrative than ever. Under new leadership, FIFA insisted the bad old days were over. New governance, term limits, a compliance structure, a promise that the men who had treated the game as a personal cash machine were gone for good. And in almost the same breath, it announced the most ambitious expansion in the tournament's history. 48 teams, a brand new global club competition, more matches, more broadcast windows, more sponsors, more money. Critics argued that this was the real tell, that an organization truly chastened by a corruption scandal might pause, might shrink, might tread carefully, and instead FIFA pressed the accelerator. Whether that represents genuine reform or simply a more polished version of the very same machine is a question people will be arguing about for a very long time. And maybe that is the real lesson buried in all of this, the thing that lasts long after the individual names have faded. Every 4 years, billions of us, more than half the planet, over the course of a tournament, pour our attention, our emotion, and quietly, our money into the World Cup. It is one of the most genuinely beautiful things humanity does together. And sitting on top of that river of feeling is a river of money so vast that it bends the behavior of powerful people around it, sometimes past the point of breaking the law. Some of that money has built the game, spread it into places that never had it, funded pitches and coaches and dreams. And some of it, the courts have now established beyond doubt, was simply stolen. Both of those things are true at the same time. So the next time you watch a World Cup, by all means lose yourself in it. That is what it is for. But somewhere in the back of your mind, remember what you are actually looking at. Not just 22 players and a ball, you are looking at the single most valuable, most fought over, and most fiercely contested set of decisions in the entire history of sport. Follow the money. It always tells you the real story.